unit of analysis is one of those challenging concepts to explain, that's a little tricky, and sometimes I think it's easier to explain just with like an overkill of examples. So we're going to talk about 3 different examples that will hopefully help to clarify what a unit of analysis is and why we care, why it matters when we're talking about data, when we're doing analysis, and when we're communicating about our data to other people. So we're going to start by trying to sort of identify what a unit of analysis actually is. So here we have a little data set. All of these numbers are completely made up, by the way, so this is just for the purposes of explanation. But here we have a little data set that has several museums, and each museum has involved themselves in some kind of program, and because of that, they've taken pre-tests and post-tests about some kind of outcome, and they've done this in multiple different years. So you'll see that we have several museums listed here, several years are listed, whether it was a pre-test, which is a 0, or a post-test, which is a 1, is listed here, and then their actual test score is listed. And you could imagine that there would be other variables also over here. There might be other characteristics of the museums, for example, or other things that might have been observed at the same time as this pre or post-test score. So we know that usually in columns we have variables and in rows we have observations. And we also know that the variables are describing the observations. They're describing information about those observations. And each row in our data set is an observation, and each row should be unique. So when we talk about unit of analysis, what we're really asking is, what is it that we are observing? What is it that our variables are describing? So when we have our data set up like this, we do have things that look like variables like year and post-test and museum, but really those things are descriptors of what makes each row unique. So we do have museums. Museum is an appropriate unit of analysis to talk about here, but it's not complete because we have multiple observations for each of these museums. You'll see we have the MOA, we have the Springville Museum of Fine Art, Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. So each of those shows up more than once in our data set. So that means it can't be the unit of analysis by itself. We are describing, these scores are describing the museums, but that's not enough information. Like, it's not just describing the museum as a whole, it's describing something more specific about that museum. So if we expand now to include year, you'll see that lots of these observations are from 2019 and some of them are from 2020. So it's true that these scores are unique to the year and the museum, that combination of things. So both museum and year are part of what the variable is describing, but that's still not totally complete. And how do we know? We know because we have museum, each museum more than once, even in the same year. So the MOA, SMOFA, and UMOCA all appear twice in 2019. And the reason for that is that we have multiple observations even within each year. And so those are your pre-test versus your post-test. So each score is actually describing a test in a year for a particular museum. If we combine those 3 things, that's what these variables are about. So just like we might have an ID variable over here and we would assign like a research ID to each of these, we would need to think about unit of analysis is whatever we would be assigning an ID to. And that identification number, that ID, should be unique for each row. So what is it that we're really identifying by that row? In this case, it's a museum in a year for a specific administration of the test. So that hopefully helps a little bit distinguish the relationship between variables and observations and unit of analysis. In this case, again, unit of analysis would be the museum in a given year for a specific test administration. That's what makes each individual row unique, and that describes what's in each row. So part of the discussion though is trying to figure out why this matters. Like, why do we care about a unit of analysis? And so I think a good way to demonstrate that is by figuring out what happens if you're not clear about that. So I have two examples here. One where at the observation level you can mix your units of analysis and end up with real problems, and another where you mix your units of analysis across variables and you can end up with problems there too. So we're going to start with this example. So here, and again these numbers are totally made up, but here we have several locations. We have Salt Lake City, West Valley City, Draper, West Jordan. We have Salt Lake County. We have Provo, Orem, Lehigh, Springville. We have Utah County, Summit County, and we have a Utah state total. Now, it's pretty common to find data sets that are organized like this. And the variable that we have here is the number of museums in those cities, counties, or in the state. And again, these numbers are completely made up, so these don't take these as true. So one of the challenges we have with a data set that's set up like this is that it has mixed units of analysis. So for example, we have several counties in here mixed in with cities, mixed in with the Utah state total. Now you can imagine that if you tried to graph this and treat it like these were all the same unit of analysis, as though they were all cities, for example, you would end up with an observation where all of the other cities have fewer than 10 museums. You'd end up with one that has 53. Well, that's because Utah State isn't a city, it's a state. It's an aggregation of all of the cities and all of the counties. Similarly, the counties in here would throw us off in this particular analysis because they're going to be aggregates of all the cities of which they're comprised. So that creates a problem for our analysis, and there are very few kinds of statistical analysis where this kind of a setup is going to be useful. This kind of data needs to be cleaned so that it all has the same unit of analysis, so that when you have a variable like number of museums, it's always describing the same unit of analysis, and there's a comparability across each of the observations. So in this case, you would either want to identify just the cities or just the counties or just the states, and filter by those and only include those in your data set and not this mixed unit of analysis, because that can create problems. And it looks like you have outliers when really it's just because you have different units of analysis mixed into the same data set. So you don't want that kind of format. So another common issue, and it happens a lot, especially with household surveys, is that sometimes you have mixed units of analysis within your variables. So here's an example of that. In this case, I want you to imagine that we have different respondents, and these are respondents who are speaking for their households. So this is maybe a household survey, and you're interviewing just one person and you're asking them questions about the household. An example of this kind of survey would be like the census, and it actually does something very similar to this. So you would gather information about, for example, the person who's responding. You might ask for the respondent's name, you might ask for their age, and then you're going to start to ask household information, like how many people are there in the household. And then within that household, you might start to ask information about the different people who live in the household. For example, what's the personal income of person number 1 in your household? And what's the personal income of person number 2 in your household? Now, what's happening here is that even though you have a single row, a single observation that's ostensibly talking about a household, you're actually talking about a bunch of different things here. So for example, this information at first, the name and age, that's the respondent. That's your unit of analysis here. But then all of a sudden we skip over to household level information. So this is no longer information just about the person. This is now information about the household. So we're mixing units of analysis. Then we're zooming into different people in the household and asking information about each of those people. And so that again goes back to the individual unit of analysis. And so you can see this is sort of a mix between a long format and a wide format data set, because we're mixing our units like that. We've got individuals and we have household all in the same set. So typically for something like this, we would want to think about what kinds of questions we have and which kind of unit of analysis is going to be most useful. Is it going to be most useful to have individual information? And if so, do we want it by person? Like, do we want all of these people in the data set, in which case we would reformat it to a long format where person 1 and person 2 are stacked so that they're separate information? Or do we want household information, in which case we probably would either aggregate all the incomes of all the people who are included, or maybe take the highest or lowest household income. But we would want to convert this information so that it's in whatever unit of analysis we're hoping to actually describe with our variables. And it's best if you can get all of the variables at the same unit of analysis. Now, sometimes you can think of things that are at different units of analysis as though they're describing a different unit. So let's talk about this respondent for a second. So if we imagine that we don't have this other like personal income information in our data set, and what we have instead is a single person who's responding for the household, and they're going to provide some individual information. But then among that individual information, there's also household information. So for example, what's the marital status of your parents? How many children did you grow up with? How many people are in your household now? Even though all of a sudden we're talking about different units of analysis, I can think about those as characteristics or variables that matter to the individual and are shaping that individual. So if I have questions about the individual, some of those characteristics that are at higher units of analysis, those might still be relevant for the person. So this is another one of those situations where there are wrong answers, but there are also many, many, many correct answers when you're thinking about unit of analysis. So the key thing to do is really zoom in and think about what is it that you want your variables to describe. Whatever you want your variables to describe, that should be your unit of analysis. Do you want your variables to describe a city? Or do you want them to describe a person or an organization or a household or an incident? And whatever it is that you want your variables to describe, you want to make sure that your data set is consistent with that unit of analysis. Hopefully those examples help a little bit with the concept. Again, this is one of those tricky concepts to explain, but I think hopefully by explaining a couple of different kinds of examples, it helps clarify a little bit.